Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're doing something very different. Yes, I play more than just Mega Man games, I also play Magic the Gathering. And so this series is just going to be about, I'll call it my modern journey, my journey through the modern format. So this will be like half deck tech, half personal experience, half analysis. Uh, don't bother with the math because we're not doing combat math in this. So, the first deck that I started with in Modern, it was back in April 2015, so we're going to do a little bit of a time warp. And it was Esper Drago Control. Now I'm a huge Control player. In fact, Control is about the only thing that I actually do play. So, and I was seeing some people play this online. In fact, this Esper Drago has a very cult following. This is what I'll say. It's like about a dozen people that they're constantly talking about it. They've got like an over 300-page thread on a forum right now. But yeah, so I saw this deck and I saw it was primarily based around Esper Charm, and I'm like, I really like Esper Charm. Instant speed, draw 2 cards, or you can destroy an enchantment or force your opponent to discard 2 cards. Well, you can force yourself, but that would be weird. And also 2 Sphinx's Revelation. I'm like, okay, this is really cool. This is the type of deck for me. And so I threw a list together, looked at some of theirs. They have like this basically core 56 cards. The idea is to run 26 lands, 4 Think Twice, 4 Esper Charm, 2 Sphinx's Revelation, 4 Paths, 2 Snapcasters, at least 3 to 4 Spell Snares, 4 Cryptics, I think I mentioned that, and White Sun Zenith as our main finisher, and 3 Supreme Verdicts. And I'm like, okay, this is cool. I'm gonna try this out. First time in the modern format. I think my deck went like 1-1-1. It was just a small 3-round tournament, and I'm like, okay. And I've changed some things. Like this isn't the only iteration of this deck I had. I have like, I think I had like about 5 or 6 different lists, and yeah, so I'm going to go over some of the card choices. Main idea behind this is to play everything at the end of your opponent's turn. Sounds great, right? And so you have like the Think Twice. This is just card draw. This can be card draw or discard. And then you want to be making your land drops every turn. That's why this deck runs 26 lands. And so, and it has Celestial Colonnades. That's another possible finisher. And 2 Tectonic Edge. The rest of this is fairly basic. There's 3 Drowned Catacombs and 1 Glacial Fortress somewhere down here. Yeah, there it is. Fetch lands run about 6 to 8 fetch lands. I chose 6 because burn and aggro are fairly popular in my meta. And you know, you've got your dual lands, the Hallowed Fountains, Watery Graves, and then your basics. Runs about 6 basics, and not too much else to say about the mana base. So, and most dedicated lists don't run another finisher. Like I had Wormcoil here, I've had Planeswalkers here, I've tried Blood Baron of Vizkopa. I wanted something with lifelink in this spot because I was struggling with getting down low on life, and a lot of times my opponent is just like 1 top deck away from being able to kill me. And that brings me to some of the issues I have with this deck, or this archetype, I should say. A lot of the times, you know, you look, you have 26 lands, you've got tons of card draw. So a lot of times you just have card draw into more card draw into more lands and card draw, and you're not really finding the answers that you need. And some of the answers that you do have are very narrow, like Spell Snare. It only counters things with converted mana cost of 2. Now I know tons of modern decks run a lot of 2-drops. We can go through, name them all: Cranial Plating, Arcbound Ravager, Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant. The list goes on and on. Uh, but if they aren't playing that, like if they start with turn 1 Birds of Paradise and you're sitting there with Spell Snare, so you play a fetch land ready to counter a 2-drop, and they go, okay, I tap my birds and play a land and tap those lands and play like a Loxodon Smiter or something. Well, your Spell Snare looks pretty silly. And in fact, a lot of your counters look pretty silly. And these counters have changed. There was times where I wasn't running Logic Knot or Negate. There was times I tried out Rune Snag. Wasn't really liking. Overall, I don't really like this deck. Now I'm going to get into more of that. Part of it is because you just draw a bunch of lands and draw spells, and no real ways to interact with your opponent on the board. Sometimes your opponent has cards that just don't care about counter spells, or they get under your counter spells because your real counters cost at least 2 mana. And so then you're trying to use Cryptic Command to tap all their creatures, draw cards, get deeper into your deck, and hopefully find one of your Supreme Verdicts. Don't find a Verdict, well, you'll lose really quickly. And I didn't really like this sort of play style, and that's why I kind of had Wormcoil Engine, because like any deck running red could just get me down low. I feel like I kind of have control of the game, but then they just burn me out. So that's why I had more life gain in the deck. And sometimes the deck just loses to itself too. And sometimes you feel like you got control of the game, but you need to find your finisher. You need to put it away. Well, you've got 1 White Sun Zenith and a few Colonnades. Ideally, you'd want 4, but I only own 3. So these are the lists that I actually have, or the cards that I actually have. So I was running one of Mystical Teachings in the main deck, which I kind of like this card, although it was also fairly expensive. Half the time I'd go fetch the White Sun Zenith, start trying to put the game away, while I still could. Because, I mean, despite all the card draw, I always felt that if my opponent gets a good top deck or 2, they can come back into this game and they can win it. And there were also times where my opponents killed me and they're like, wow, I was so afraid of what you had in your hand, because they saw my hand was full of like 6 or 7 cards. And I'm like, well, I had lands and draw spells and counter spells that don't interact with the stuff that you already have on the board. And so it became frustrating for me for a while. And so would I run this deck again? Probably not. I don't really care for it. I had one of Mindbreak Track. That was another fun thing to search for Mystical Teachings. Storm and Tron were kind of big in my meta at the time, and yeah, being able to exile an Emrakul, that was nice, or just a free counter all Storm cards, exile all Storm cards. That was very nice. So I had that in there. There was a time where I had 2 Supreme Verdicts and 1 Consume the Meek. Let me go ahead and bring that up here. Consume the Meek. And, it wasn't a bad card, but it cost double black, which was kind of hard to get with our mana base when we're trying to get, triple white for White Sun Zenith and triple blue for Cryptic Command. But it did give me a tutorable mass creature removal, stopped regeneration as well for however often that's relevant, but it was also a 5 mana board wipe as well, so I had some issues with it. Overall, I felt that the Consume the Meek, even with Mystical Teachings, wasn't really worth it. And I could be running some of the cards in this deck wrong. Maybe a Negate and Mystical Teachings, and definitely nowadays the Mindbreak Trap would be something else. There was a point where I tried putting 2 Condemns in the main deck as well in place of some of these. Still, it felt a little bit better, but still kind of getting the same results. Every game just basically felt like a really uphill battle. Like I was starting out the game handicapping myself by playing this deck. Because sometimes since the majority of your deck is draw spells and lands, you'll have an opener with just lands and draw spells. What do you do with that? You know, I mean, you can keep it, try to get some interaction. Hopefully, your opponent doesn't kill you or drop something nasty before then, and that's really all you hope for. And you know, that just wasn't my style. I mean, I did all right with the deck. I don't think I ever went into a local Friday night Magic or um, Tuesday night. My local game shop also runs Modern on Tuesday nights. I'd go there, and I don't think I've ever, you know, not won a match with the deck in a tournament. But I've always felt like I was falling somewhere in the middle of the pack. Um, and I just felt like the deck loses to almost everything, or has the potential to lose to almost everything. I mean, well, of course, that statement seems a little silly because that's kind of how Magic is. You know, your opponent's deck is designed to win somehow, but yeah, this deck just didn't feel like I could interact well with it. I never really felt in control with it. Sideboard, we'll go to the sideboard real quick. Duress and Thoughtseize. Um, Duress for burn. I like not having to take damage playing my targeted discard. Also good against Tron, get their cards out of their hands. Celestial Purge, that was good against again Burn, Blood Moon, um, Jund. It gets rid of a Liliana that happens to resolve. It's also why I ended up playing at least some amount of negates in the deck. We've got 2 Devour Flesh here in the sideboard. It wasn't always in the sideboard, but I've learned over time that I always want to have sacrifice effects in the sideboard. You'll see some trends in my sideboards. I'll almost always include 2 dispels, 2 sacrifice effects, and 2 ways to mass removal the graveyard. You don't see some of that here. Because, like I said, I was new to Modern at the time, and I went through so many different sideboards, so I know all these cards were in the sideboard at some point. Disenchant, extra removal against artifacts or enchantments, especially Affinity. Stony Silence, Affinity. Kind of helps with Tron, but ultimately my opinion on using Stony Silence against Tron, especially in this type of deck, you're only going to slow them down a little bit. Same with like the 2 Tech Edge. You've only got 2 Tech Edge, 2 Stony Silence. That's not enough to be good against Tron. So Tron was always a difficult matchup for me. And it's a very difficult matchup for control decks in general in the Modern format. I'll be talking more about Tron a little bit later, but Stony Silence I don't believe is enough of an answer. I mean, it shuts down their eggs, but they can still just, you know, draw Tron naturally, or like the Tron players I know, they'll side in for Nature's Claim against any white deck because they're expecting Stony Silence and things like that. So it's not a permanent answer. And since this deck can spend 30 minutes not winning a game, so you're going into the long game, Tron will eventually get online against this particular build. Zealous Persecution, I like this card. I'm kind of surprised I don't see it more often, but it's a nice little sweeper against your opponent, instant speed sweeper as well, against your opponent's creatures. Very nice against like Infect, Affinity, even Boggles before they can get an enchantment up, or in response to their aura. 2 Pulse of the Fields. This is another fun little card that I had in there against burn decks. And 4th Verdict, you know, any list I had, I could never find a 4th Verdict, but in other control decks where I run 3 main deck verdicts, I always put in the 4th Verdict in the sideboard. And if I ever go back to this deck, I'd probably do just that. Just because in the matchups where you want Supreme Verdict, you really want Supreme Verdict. So that's kind of the gist of the deck. Um, like I said, I up until a few weeks ago, I would have called this the worst deck I've ever played in Modern. Uh, like I said, I realize there's a cult following. I'm not trying to hate on Esper Draw Go, but the deck just it just felt like I was putting myself behind in the game from the get-go, and not really where I want to be. I never really felt in control when I was playing this deck. And so for those that do play Esper Drago and they are having success with this, kudos to you. I respect you. I respect your deck choice, but this just wasn't for me. Towards the end of the evolution with this deck, I played it for several months. I ended up trying out a couple Shadow of Doubts. So Shadow of Doubt, let me go ahead and bring that up, if I can type. So Shadow of Doubt is this little 2-mana instant, says players can't search libraries this turn and draw a card. Seems pretty innocent enough, but you can use that in response to your opponent sacrificing their fetch land to go and search their deck for a land, and suddenly you cast Shadow of Doubt in response to that. Well, your opponent just paid 1 life and lost a land. They do not get to search their deck, and you get to draw a card. And so I tried out a couple of these in this Esper Drago as well. What I found is that it could really disrupt the opponent. It could disrupt their mana base, and then Esper Drago, well, it will sit there and do nothing, and continue to do nothing. It had no real follow-up play to that. But it can look really devastating when your opponent is sitting there on 1 land and you're dropping your 3rd land into play. But like I said, this deck had no follow-up to that. But I saw that, and it was kind of interesting. I mean, the game went on. I played more draw spells. He eventually drew into more lands, and ultimately, cutting them off of that 1 land didn't really do much in the long run of that game. So ultimately, I don't think Shadow of Doubt is where this deck wants to be. But I like that interaction that Shadow of Doubt had there. And so the next deck that I jumped to was based around, or built around, Shadow of Doubt, and built around that whole idea of, okay, you're going to fetch, I'm going to Shadow of Doubt you, and then I'm going to follow up with something and put some pressure on you. And that's when we'll get into one of my most successful modern decks, but that will be for next time.